Hey y'all, so we're reading Islam and the Making of Portugal, and I really like this section because it gets into this thing that I learned from psychology of race and racism, and this is why I liked being a psychology major and an Afro studies minor, because when you put psychology and history, like two things that are like could be considered like observable science. I mean, yeah, well psychology is an observable science and an experimental as well. It's a natural science, and then with history, it's a social science. Girl, it makes everything make sense. And for a little bit, I went crazy a little bit because I was like, but anyways, so the origins of racism is one thing that we talked about, and historical forces in Europe shaped and okay, I'm recording on my iPad. This is my notebook. I made a TikTok video about this, but then I took it down because I was like, oh my god, I can do better. Because girl, it was when I first just started talking, and I was like, oh my god, I get to talk about what I learned. And then doing that over and over again, I've learned how I've like messed up, because sometimes girl, when I talk, see how I'm already rambling. Sometimes when I talk like in front of like people, oh my god, it's so bad. I have bad anxiety in doing public speaking, but like it's so weird. Like I was a cheerleader though, but that's the thing, I wasn't speaking. That's why but anyways, I've learned and I've reflected, and I'm like, oh my god. But sometimes I just like to talk because I love to talk. It's my favorite activity. The origins of racism is historical forces in Europe shaped and redefined. Oh, but this is something that we learned from psychology of race and racism, and I took this class in 2021. Okay, talking about Manichean order, my sister did. Yeah, this is from March 1st, 2022. Excuse me, 2022. And so 14th and 15th centuries of Europe, famine, disease, and this is literally what we're going to get into. So it's interesting to see those patterns happening, and it's like, oh my god, my sister's vacuuming. 14th and 15th centuries of Europe, famine, disease, war and rebellion, violent, petty criminals / highwaymen, church-sponsored inquisition, conflict over land / national war. Oh, but I will remake the videos, but I'm going to do it in a different way, just because I didn't like the way that I did it beforehand. And I need to learn how to make this a PDF so that people could like read it if they're interested. But I don't know how to make my notes a PDF by keeping them in the order that they're in. I am a little bit technologically. I like handwritten notes, bro. Like I don't even. Anyways, emotional contagion, emotional states being passed from one to another, fear, anger, and hatred, expansionism, Colombian legacy, outgrowth and escape, geographical solution, and facilitated economic recovery. Oh my god, and then I read this book. I did not read it. I started it. Okay. Okay. My grandmother's hands, and it's so crazy, and it's so interesting. Race before racism, the discrimination of outgroup, mid-class effort to establish poor class okay. Yeah. Religion, Prester John, no corruption in like in like Christian whatever. Christian ideal had internal and external functions. Internal set standard Christian measured itself. Oh, set a standard in which Christians measured themselves, highlighting failures and corruption of others. External provided lens, European view, land beyond continent, new non-European land lose their authenticity in European eyes, not independent but seen as not able to fulfill myth. Use religion as a justification of European conquest of land. If it did not fit the myth of Prester John, then they see them as savage beasts. Academia, sorry, I have cotton mouth like crazy. Like, oh my goodness. Academia, oh my god, I say like a lot. I have this, oh my god, I need to talk to this teacher. My life has been, girl. Academia provided the expanding political and economic forces on intellectual foundation for white supremacy. And it gets into like even some people. It's so interesting, but anyway. Okay, European. It talks about how racism saturated in every aspect of human existence. Deep-seated structural problems of Europe fueled aggressive posture Europeans took to viewing the world. And before modern racist ideology, Europeans prone to racist thinking, disease of white supremacy is chronic and pervasive. European. Oh, my grandmother's hands, y'all. It talks about the racial trauma for everybody. Like, how do you heal it? Even it talks even. There's a chapter, whiteness without supremacy. Um, Oh, this is so fun. Be critical when using psychology to understand oppression, understand history that determine nature of social existence, boundaries of individual biographies, and direction of discipline. Psychology provides tools for analysis, but it is an extension of racist intellectual tradition. Oh my god, yeah, because psychology as a foundation, girl, there was a freaking Let me get into the book. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. That was so many thoughts. But there was a literal mental illness called drapetomania that if a black person was running to freedom, that was considered a mental illness. Like the psychology as a field was built off of racism. When you get into black psychology, these black psychologists said, girl, we gonna use your tools, flip it and reverse it, and make y'all look like a fool. Anyways, Islam and the making of Portugal. Thank you for being here for this whole entire long introduction. Anyways, oh my goodness. Okay. Keeping in mind that our interest in the effects of Muslim civilization on Europe is related to the attempt to reconstruct the processes by which the African past was extracted from European consciousness, perhaps the greatest irony of this history concerns the founding of the Portuguese state and the ruling class that ran it. The Portuguese state's expansion into Africa marks, of course, the beginning of the modern era in European development, the age of discovery. And that's the part we're focusing on. Ooh, in terms of reading that helps with college is like, okay, what's the main point? Sometimes there's a lot of words, and I'm like, oh my God, what? And so, let me keep reading, but pretty much like, when you could like, what's the main point? What's the I was supposed to order some stuff. There's a lot of stuff I was supposed to do today. When you're like trying to read and be like, okay, what are they trying to say? It's like, yeah. Sorry, that thought should have been staying in my mind. It also marks the beginning of those encounters between the peoples of the European peninsula and the African continent that would produce the Negro. The appearance and development of the Portuguese state were also the results of the processes both directly and indirectly related to Muslim civilization. Though Anglo-Saxonist shrouds persist in many English language treatments, I have really bad I can hear myself talk, and I can hear the. But I also think the allergic reaction, because it's on my lips, it affects the way that I'm speaking as well. But it's almost gone. Anyways. But yeah, I've noticed that sometimes the allergic reaction affects the way that I speak because of like, you know how your lips are a part of the like. You know. Okay. Though Anglo-Saxonist shrouds persist in many English language treatments of Portuguese history, no doubt in part, this is in parentheses, no doubt in part attributable to Portugal's client relation to Britain since the 18th century. Oh, they're saying that there's a rewriting of history in like an Anglo-Saxonist whitewashed way because of the way that they're like both like the nations are built off of white supremacy, like the way that America is. You know how America like engages in like revisionist history that, like that. End of that parentheses. These stories bear some relationship to the past. For instance, in the mid 12th century, as Trevor Roper recalls, A party of English and Flemish crusaders sailing towards the Mediterranean to join the Second Crusade arrived at the mouth of the river of Sarono. Suro, Souro. Suro. They were easily persuaded that there was no need to sail further. There were infidels in Portugal and lands as rich as in Palestine. The Crusaders agreed. They stayed. Instead of Edessa, they captured Lisbon. I don't know how people pronounce things differently. I try to pronounce how people say caramel. Lisbon. 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 And having masqueraded the Muslim inhabitants and installed themselves on their lands, they forgot about the Christian kingdom of Jerusalem and founded that of Portugal. As British historian Trevor Roper gives due weight to the English intervention but ignores their Iberian and French allies, example given Henry of Burgundy, nevertheless, it is true that erstwhile Crusaders played an important part in the establishment of Portugal during the colonial wars against the Muslims. As America, wait, what? Oh, it is important that the Crusaders played an important part in the establishment of Portugal during the colonial wars against the Muslims. As Americo Castro declares, the fleet engaged in the conquest of Lisbon had weighed The fleet engaged in the conquest of Lisbon. See, I told y'all I got a learning disability. Don't make fun of me. People did not like when I would read out loud for the class, but honestly, reading out loud makes me comprehend the information more. Like as I've been that's what I've kind of noticed as I've been reading the book for YouTube. And rereading it. I mean, also when I first read it, I was going through burnout and I was having the allergic reaction and I didn't even clock it. It was, girl, my life was falling apart. I mean, it was a good thing though. But during and college, Jesus. Sorry for that again. I keep doing that. The fleet engaged in the conquest of Lisbon had weighed anchor in England, while 169 ships provided and manned by Englishmen, Germans, Flemings, Frenchmen, and Gascons. The towers raised for the conquest of the city. The towers raised for the conquest of the city were the workings of Flemings, Englishmen, and an engineer from Pisa. All the booty was for the foreigners who, through a pact with the Moors, took for themselves the gold, the silver, the clothing, the horses, and the mules, and gave the city to the king. And then think about that now. Okay, you see that literal connection to how, so yesterday I watched Netanyahu's address to Congress, and he said this thing about, Israelis come from every part of the world. And it reminded me of that connection in terms of first of all, a lot of the things that he said, I wrote this down. A lot of the things that he said, if you're listening for them, you can hear the anti-black rhetoric, the anti-indigenous rhetoric. He said thug, terrorist. I'm recording a video. Sorry. But it's that same rhetoric that was used against indigenous people here in America, the same rhetoric that's used against for the colonization of Ireland, a couple chapters back. The same, and it's taught, and you can hear when you notice it and you can hear it, you can understand why racism has not been desocialized from our socialization within this culture of the West, because it's needed to be able, because racism and this is what this book is talking about, obviously, but you could hear the book is pointing to thus far how racism is embedded within the Western civilization. And even here, how the settlers, even thinking about South Africa too, Where them white people come from? Right. All these other places, and you can hear like the rhetoric of Western, like, and how they're from all these other places for capitalistic development to be able to conquer this place. And you can see these roots even in the founding of Portugal. That's what I'm learning. That's what I'm seeing in terms of the patterns. And here it's even saying like the fleet engaged in the conquest of Lisbon and weighed anchor in England. Oh wait, and had weighed la la la. Conquest of Lisbon had weighed anchor in England with 169 ships provided and manned by Englishmen, Germans, Flemings, Frenchmen, and Gascons. Like that found that repeated pattern, and like the West is literally living in its history over and over and over again because it has to keep developing for a capitalistic whatever. And now it's like, well, but anyways, sorry. That's really interesting though. I mean, not interesting like good, but interesting in terms of like seeing those patterns persist, and then okay, so what do we do now? And that's the, you know what I mean, like the next questions that moving forward. But you have to understand the past to understand the present. So yeah, it's interesting to me. I just like history. 300 years later, as the dominant legend goes on, unexorcised by the wars and internal conflicts besetting the leading powers of Western Europe, geographically proximate to the West African Atlantic coast. Wait. With both a direct experience of long distance trade and one borrowed from the Italian merchants, and then this is in parentheses, who had began their own commercial colonization of Portugal by the 13th century, and with a powerful residue of Christian anti Islamic adventurism, the Portuguese state launched the first of the great discoveries that would mature into the modern world systems of Europe and European colonies. Okay, I'm probably going to reread that because I kind of read that broken. Wait. Okay, yeah. 300 years later, as the dominant legend goes on, unexorcised by the wars and internal conflicts besetting the powers of Western Europe, geographically proximate to the West African Atlantic coast, with both a direct experience of long-distance sea trade and one borrowed from the Italian merchants who had begun their own commercial colonization of Portugal by the 13th century, and with the powerful residue of Christian anti-Islamic adventurism, the Portuguese state launched the first of the great discoveries that would mature into the modern world systems of Europe and European colonies. By the 15th century, Portugal and her Italian and English partners had transformed sugar production, the plantation system, and, of course, the system of slavery from the islands of the eastern Mediterranean to those of the eastern Atlantic. By the 16th century, Spain had inherited the Italian capitalists and all that went with them, and so had the New World. Grody. That's gonna be in the TikTok I make. But ew. Still, as Castro had warned, it is impossible to understand the formation of the immense Portuguese empire solely on the terms of economic or statistical analysis. It might be added that this is particularly the case when such analysis is based on indifferent historical reconstructions. The peacefulness of Portugal's 15th century, with C.R. Boxer, which C.R. Boxer asserts and Wallerstein repeats, for example, is to be doubted. When one learns elsewhere that the century was punctuated by a martial and diplomatic war with Castile, and that the century ended with the homicidal suppression of a dynastic struggle. Castro himself came to the conclusion that much more attention had to be paid to Portuguese nationalism. Portugal wanted and believed a history of her own. This is the quotation. And she did this with such intensity that she was successful little by little, incorporating both an imagined history and the practice of imagining it into the process of her authentic existence. Think about that with America. The imperial enterprises, the enduring imprint of Portugal and Brazil in the East Indies and in Africa, the imposing figures of Vasco da Gama, Afonso de Albuquerque, I think that's how it's pronounced, Ferdinand Magellan, and others, the work of Gil Vicente and Camoems, Camoems, all this and more had motivated the recreation of the origins of Portugal. This, however, was not a simple nationalism, a mass ethos bound to a national destiny. The Portuguese of the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries were an extraordinary mix of Western European and Mediterranean peoples. More important, the new nation's ruling class, the nobility and the bourgeoisie, who wove the ideological tapestry of nationalism and constructed those ideographs that framed their families and deeds, were drawn from the landed and titled aristocracies of Spain, Castile, Aragon, and Catalonia, France, the Flanders and Burgundy, and England. See that? That's really interesting. It's like, even thinking about like America and how that was founded, it was like people were like fleeing from Europe, and then anyways, let me just keep reading. But it's really interesting how like the nation is built with like these people on top coming from all these other places. You know what I mean? Anyways, the threads of Portuguese nationalist idea were spun from a European source. Portugal inherited I think that's the important part right there. Portugal inherited, consequently, not merely its royal houses and their Italian capitalist creditors, but as well as the mercantile and scientific migration was that was the social and intellectual efflux of Venice, Genoa, Pisa, Majorca, Florence, Flanders, Catalonia, and England. With these disparate, let's look up how to pronounce that. Guys, don't make fun of me. I'd be mad. Disparate. Essentially different in kind, not allowing comparison. With these disparate elements came, too, a certain malaise. I do need to get a dictionary, though. I keep saying that. Malaise is a general feeling of discomfort, weakness, or lack of well-being. Discomfort. Weakness. ... And the resolve to construct a state whose character would be distinct from the corrupt, chaotic, and mean societies from which they fled or had been driven. And then here's a quote. Those Europeans found Europe morally distasteful, with constant Girl, sometimes I do feel a little dumb, but it's okay. Internecine. Distinctive on both sides in the conflict. Distinctive. No, destructive. Destructive. Girl, I'm not gonna know what I wrote. Violent. Okay. Violent wars between so-called Christian princes, the heresy rife and the schism a fact for almost 40 years, with confused relations ever apparent between ecclesiastical and secular authority, with charity often non existent, with marriage made a mockery and adultery widespread, with lying and unvarnished thievery apparent on every side. It was again this nationalism, and particularly the elements of Muslim antagonism, that played such a critical role in Portuguese expansionism in the 14th century. Robert Silverberg, in chronicling Portugal's and Europe's fascination with Prester John, had recorded, and the quote is, in 1411, when Portugal had arrived at an unaccustomed state of complete peace, João of Avis adopted a suggestion of his English-born queen, Philippa. To maintain the momentum of the national economy, he would send an armed expedition to North Africa. Why does that sound like now with it, like it's like the imperial wars, genocides that are going on? For national economy, for democracy. João, I don't think I'm pronouncing his name correctly. Joao, but it looks like João or Joa. Mine stop. So we're just gonna say João. And Philippa, it's Philippa. Envisioned a conquest of the Moorish kingdom of Fez, thus opening the way for a Portuguese penetration by land of Prester John's kingdom, somewhere in the heart of Africa. With Prester John's cooperation, perhaps a new spice route could be established. See that? Like the use of religion to like bolster economic development. Like, in the name of God. Sorry. No, okay, let me stop. Okay. With Prester John's cooperation, perhaps a new spice route could be established, with caravans crossing Africa from Morocco to the Red Sea and bringing pepper and cloves to Lisbon. Dom Henrique, in parentheses, the navigator, who was credited with marshaling the energies of Portugal, the resources of the Order of Christ, and the skills and instruments of Europe's most developed seamanship, and the navigational wisdom of Muslim and Italian mathematicians, cartographers, astronomers, and geographers for the purpose of exploring Africa and its close coastline for a route to the Indies and to Prester John, was, of course, the ascetic, ASCETIC. I definitely need a dictionary, and I need to start doing those, like, where you just learn each word. Because I don't feel dumb. I feel unknowledgeable. Is someone who lives in a simple ascetic. Oh, haha, I was right. Characterized by suggesting the practice of severe self-discipline and abstaining from all forms of indulgence, self-denying. Ooh. Typically for religious reasons. Oh, it's right. Okay. Celibate is the next word. Okay. Was, of course, the ascetic, celibate, and reclusive son of the new royal João and Philippa. Following the Portuguese capture of Ceuta, Ceuta, in 1415, for more than 40 years, Dom Henrique dedicated himself to the achievement of his parents' dream. Oh, he's the son of them. Okay. And he's like continuing that like colonialistic. Yeah, that's what that's telling me. Henrique, however, was not distinctive in this regard. He was, in reality, simply a more psychologically severe version of his family and the class with whose destiny it was intimately linked. Francis Roger quite effectively argued Lusitanian, girl, Lusitanian. Translation of the European dreams concerning the East into action was precipitated not by Quetta, but by the simultaneous Council of Constance. It gained further impetus with Brother Pedro's travels and finally direction by Portuguese relations with Pope Eugene IV and the Council of Ferrara, Florence, Rome. I am convinced that various manifestations of Western Europe's great Oriental dream came to bear on Pedro as he wandered, and that by, let us say, 1433 or 1434, the beginning of Duarte's reign, the royal brothers, including and most especially Henry, had talked over at length the exciting report related by Pedro upon his return. Oh, you can, in this part, you can kind of see like the story, like a kind of like a hero's journey type of thing, in my opinion. But then like also like that journey of Prester John and like, oh, I have to go do that. You know what I mean? But this is really interesting. But this is like the show highlighting what this is telling me right now is like highlighting how the European dreams concerning the East, and then also that the various manifestations of Western Europe's great Oriental dream and how that is reflected in Dom Henrique's motives. That's the next sentence. So, Gomez Enayes de Azura, I'm sorry if I butchered it. Gomez. His historian contemporary recorded Dom Henrique's motives, and here are the motives. 1. Henrique desired to know what lands were beyond the Canary Islands and a cape called Bojador. 2. If in these territories there should be any populations of Christians, and that's that Prester John, or any harbors where men can enter without peril, they could bring back to the realm many merchandises at little cost. 3. It was said that the power of the Moors of the land of Africa was very much greater than was generally thought, and that there were among them neither Christians nor other races, and because every wise man is moved by desire to know the strength of his enemy. 4. During one of the 30-year battles with the Moors, the Infante had never found Christian king or girl, what? Sorry. Seigneur, a feudal lord. Let's write that down. Feudal lord. Outside this kingdom, who, for the love of our Lord Jesus Christ, was willing to aid him in this war. That's so interesting. He desired to know whether in those regions there might be any Christian princes in whom the charity and love of Christ were strong enough to cause them to aid him against these enemies of the faith. Do you notice how like religion is used to like justify that though? Like even in like the history of this European, the manifestation of Western Europe's great Oriental dream. Number 5, lost souls should be saved. And this one's interesting, actually. 6, the astrological reason from which all the others proceeded, that as Henrique was born on 4 March 1394, he said, because he's an Aries. Listen, was under the influence of the ram, which is in his house of Mars with the sun in the ascendant, y'all. This indicated that this prince was bound to engage in great and noble conquests, and above all, he was bound to attempt the discovery of things which were hidden from other men and secret. He said, oh, wow, wait. Anyways, he said, because he's an Aries, and because it's in his house of Mars, he's bound to conquer and conquest and fulfill his colonialistic dream. That is so interesting. Silverberg added, in order to underscore his own interests, that Henrique had told one of his companions in 1442 he desired to have knowledge not only of Africa and the Indies, but the land of Prester John as well, as if he could. And like you see, like the connection to that thing, I definitely will figure out a way. I sometimes when I try things, sometimes I get a little discouraged, but also I've been having so much stuff to do. But I'll figure out how to like make it a PDF, but in order, so I can post the notes. But I hope my my handwriting is not always the best. 100 years later, at the beginning of the 16th century, the quest that had so obsessed the House of Avis from its own beginnings, and before it Europe for 300 years, was finally completed. Pero de Colvija, the Portuguese king, from 1495 to 1521, Manuel the First's emissary to Prester John's kingdom, was discovered by his ambassadorial successors, who have become an honored but unwilling captive for life in the court of Ethiopia. Islam had provided for the emerging Europe a powerful This is what I think is like the most important, not like most important. Like obviously all this information is important, but when we go back to like keeping in mind our interest in the effects of Muslim civilization on Europe, is related to the attempt to reconstruct the process of which the African past was extracted. And then you can see here even the lost souls shall be saved, like the Venetian order, anti-blackness type of thing, the devil, Prester John, and Christianity. And then when we're getting here, like that's what, when you put it together, like even for myself, sometimes when I read it, I have to read it a couple times to be like, oh, got it. But then when it gets into Islam had provided for the emerging Europe a powerful ideological, economic, and political impulse. There was, however, one element in Islamic civilization that had little or no effect on medieval Europe, as the latter was being transformed into the center of a dominant world system. This was the Muslim concept of the slave. Great differences persisted between slavery in Western and Christian societies and slavery in Islam. Because the Christians was like, no, you are, no, let me just keep reading, because, yeah, see, caught myself. The prophet had said, and here's the quote, "Fear God concerning your slaves. Feed them with what you eat and clothe them with what you wear, and do not give them work beyond their capacity. Those whom you like, whom you like, keep, and those whom you dislike, sell. Do not cause pain on God's creation." And I think that's so interesting in ways in which like religiosity within the Black church and Black people has been used as a means for slavery. He said, if we all God's children, like David Walker's appeal, or someone else. I'm thinking about someone's poem. Oh, it might have been for African American literature course, so I don't think it might have been David Walker. But he said, if we all God's children, shouldn't we all be free? We're walking home to the Egypt land. Wait, it is the Okay, yeah. Wait, look, see that? See, I get too excited to see the connections, y'all. It's my favorite. It's so interesting. Okay, do not cause pain on God's creation. He caused you to own them, and he had so wished he would have made them and had he so wished, he would have made them own you. Do unto others as if you would want done unto you, or do unto others as if they are, you know what I mean? Like, doesn't that relate to that? Anyways, the Islamic ideal concerning slavery was without parallel in Christian law and dogma. Islamic jurists had codified both the liabilities and the rights of slaves. Customs among the Sunni, Shia, and Maliki schools had I don't know if I said any of that correctly, but I think I said Sunni, right? Sunni, Shia, and Maliki schools had limited the rights of masters and extended the legal, religious, and social capacities of the slave. The Quran encouraged manumission as the act of piety. I think that's how it's said, piety, because it's piety, Piety, piety. Let's look it up.
Piety.
Haha. The quality of being religious or reverent. Devotion. Okay. In many instances, the punishment for criminal acts was less. In many instances, the punishment for criminal acts were less harsh. Dang, I can hear it. I don't pronounce acts. Acts. Do you hear that? Acts. I say axe. It sounds like an axe when I'm saying act. ACTS. Dang. Was less harsh for the slave than the free man. Slaves might purchase their freedom and might assume second rank offices in state administration and the religious hierarchy. Since Muslim slavery was characteristically associated with unlimited potential for social mobility and much less racialism, it is not surprising to find whole dynasties in Muslim history founded by slaves. Example given, the Egyptian Mamelukes, or the emergence to prominence of Africans as soldiers, poets, philosophers, writers, and statesmen as early as the 18th century. Ibrahim, the son of a black concubine of the Caliph al-Mahdi from 775 to 85, came very close to being Caliph in... What? Let's look up what that means, maybe. Caliph, the chief Muslim civil and religious ruler. Oh, Caliph. Oh. In 817 through 19, when a faction in Baghdad supported his candidature against the nominated successor of the Caliph al-Ma'mun, in spite of being excessively black and shiny. In spite of being excessively black and shiny, he was preferred by some Abbasid loyalists to the Alid candidate of Persian descent. Mustansir, Mustansir. I might need to get checked for like an actual. I might actually need to get checked, y'all, because I'm really. Sometimes when I'm like, dang, because I do actually have difficulties when I read. Like I was in one of them classes as a kid, but I like reading. It's fun. But reading out loud, y'all. Another such son, Hunwick reports, reigned in Egypt between 1036 and 1094. In the 7th century, Mulay Ismaili, ISMA apostrophe IL, sharing the same condition, ruled in Morocco. Even black eunuchs, EUNUCH, such as Kafur, who ruled Egypt for 22 years, could achieve enormous power. Okay, girl, sorry. But it's highlighting the differences in Muslim culture compared to Christian culture. Oh, Lord. The Christendom failed to be impressed by Islamic law and customs on the matter. On this matter is hardly surprising, since the traditions of European slavery were already quite ancient and quite elaborately rationalized by the time of the appearance of Islam in the 7th century. Moreover, it was highly improbable that the Christian establishment of the medieval era would countenance the adoption of customs from what they considered the ultimate Christian heresy, Islam. Oh, this is really because they're okay. That's one of the most important parts too, in terms of like. What are the differences between Western and Christian societies compared to Islam? And they were like, okay, so Islam is more like, okay, we respect the humanity and people, and then Christendom is like, nah, we don't respect the other. And it's already been quite established. And then Islam being the ultimate Christian heresy. Okay, sorry. Sometimes I'm like, when I say things out loud, sometimes I'm even like making sense of it for myself too. Islam, many believed, was based on sexual license. What, Alana? License. Let's make sure. Because what does that mean? Enforced conversion? That sounds like, wait, that says license. Yeah. Was based on sexual license? What does that mean? Sexual license is a negative term for non-restrictive sexual norms, which can also be called sexual freedom. Oh, okay. Okay, And finally, Western xenophobia. So critical to the character of European identity and so fundamental to Christian slave systems. That's very interesting. Sorry, I like that part. Expressed a revulsion towards Muslim ideals. A fund of xenophobia was latent. In the was latent in the homogeneous culture of Europe, is how Norman Daniel has put it. Further, and this is the quote: xenophobia and hysteria were compounded in the inception of the Crusades, and it is what's going on with my brain? And it is a mistake to view them as isolable phenomenon. They're not isolated. They're embedded, embedded. Okay. They were just one European activity: fighting, robbing, killing, trading, making profits, taking rents or tributes. All of these were closely linked to the philosophical and theological analyses, to the composition of history and propaganda, and even to love of one's neighbor. The Crusades renewed the idea that we need not to do as we would be done by. They were also an expression of a much older history of suspicion. The expectation of difference goes back to the cultural intolerance of barbarians, which is one of the less useful legacies of Greece. Okay, it's saying that xenophobia and this hysteria is like one of the bases of, it was critical to Western civilization and the Christian slave system. And then think about how also slavery plays into that, and then how that compound, and then like Christendom, blah 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 blah, how that all compounds. That's what it's building up to for me. Oh, sorry. Sometimes I'm thinking about this out loud. I'm like, okay, how do I make that make sense? Because I'm just gonna keep that thought in my head and come back to that idea when I do it. Okay. This is not to deny that there were no differences among Christians respecting slavery. There was in medieval Christendom as later. Debates between Christian masters notwithstanding, David Byron Davis observed that the distinctive characteristics of medieval theology was to justify the existing world while providing the means for escaping from it. That literally sounds like right now, like with America. You know what I mean? Like, it's providing, you know what I mean? Okay. I'll have to come back to that and find like some examples. Like how we're living in, like, you know what I mean? Okay. In the late medieval age, the defenders of slavery, whether the issue was the enslavement of Europeans, infidels, Indians, or blacks, frequently turned to the pages of Aristotle. To justify slavery as a natural condition in some parts of mankind. That's really interesting. You know how, like, okay, so Aristotle, and then for philosophy, like religious philosophy, and then Darwin, social Darwinism, all that stuff for the scientific justification for like racism in a sense, or like, you know what I mean? Okay, where are we going? Oh, there it is. In the early 16th century, when Fray Bartholomew de Las Casas converted from colonialistic to anti-colonialistic pamphleteer, he said, "Oh, I've been saved." No, but this guy, it was Aristotle whom he was forced to confront and use for his own purposes. So this guy is critiquing Aristotle. He described Aristotle as a Gentile burning in hell whose doctrine we do not need to follow except insofar as it conforms to Christian truth. But La Casas equally applied the Aristotelian model to prove that the Indians, and I don't like they say Indians, the indigenous were rational beings, not one whit inferior to the Spaniards or any European, ancient or modern for that matter, but in some respects even superior to the Europeans. Ha! That's what I say today. Like, haha. And that's what I love. The ways in which, okay, this even this like relates to Black psychology. Like the first wave of Black. Yes. I need to turn my phone off and turn it back on. Okay. Oh, but this first wave of Black psychologists, they use the like anti-Black statistics and this and a third and flipped it and reversed it and said, "Uh-oh." That's what I love that I love that they use their own tools to be like, "Oh, actually you're wrong." Anyways, sorry. La Casa's ploy met, however, with only quite limited success in either his own time or later. Oops, we're at 10%. It's because I've been on here for an hour. This is just going to be a one video upload. This was a long pages. I need to learn how to stop talking so much though. But I love to talk, and it's interesting to me. But look, we're almost done, y'all. 2 pages and then we're on chapter 5. Las Casas' ploy met, however, only with quite limited success in either his own time or later. His very brief account of the destruction of the Indies, which is in italics, so it's like a book, I guess, was roundly denounced by his contemporaries and their successors. Aristotle's aristocracy of race was proved to be much closer to the core of Western civilization than the complaints of Las Casas. So, like, even now, how people, like, anyways. That's really interesting, though. His fellow priests, Motolinia and De Landa, are such co-sympathizers as Governor de Castienda of Nicaragua and the autonomous bureaucrat who reported on the brutal excesses of Viceroy de Mendoza of Spain, as Mavis Campbell had suggested with pol- polemical what? How do I say this? Oh my god, I turned my phone off. Dang it. I can't turn it back on right now. Polemical force. I need to look that word up. It should not be too out of place to remind ourselves here that the concept of race has never since been too far from the European psyche, peering out sporadically with blue eyes and lily white skin, whether through the grotesque Spilduvia. That's so interesting. I'm reading Black Metamorphosis by Sylvia Wynter, and she talks about this I said that wrong. Sepulveda, one of Las Casas' most persistent opponents, who spoke of the superior Spaniards and applied the very Greek word barbarian to the Indians, or through Count Gobineau, or Richard Wagner and his son-in-law, Houston Stewart Chamberlain, or Thomas Carlyle, who had much influence on New World slavery, culminating in the megalomaniac excesses of Hitler and the racist regimes of Southern Africa. Dude, I want to look these people up and be like, okay, what did they even say? Because let's denounce it. Aristotle was thus sustained in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This is one of the most important parts that for me too. Like, I mean, there's a lot of important parts, like this part, then the xenophobia part, and then like also talking about the Oriental dream and like how to show the comparison and whatever. Okay, that's giving me an idea of how I'm gonna like write those notes or like talk about it. Aristotle was thus sustained into the late 19th and early 20th centuries until a more scientific rationale would overtake the ideological needs of the new imperialism. Still, through Aristotle, the convergence of moral resolution and practical necessities between Christian societies of the medieval and modern periods and the slave societies of the pre-Christian era was striking. From the Homeric period onward, the passionate adherence to the Greeks to the desire for political and personal liberty made it difficult for them to find a satisfactory explanation for their own slave organization. Plato's reaction took the form of a mild protest that Greeks should not enslave their fellow Greeks, while, as a matter of fact, the Hellenes of his day were using their fellow Hellenes as slaves, and without much compunction. Compunctation. We have to look that up when my phone turned back on about it. Aristotle's explanation of the origin of slavery was rationally based upon the then accepted theory of congenital and heritable. I think that's like the biology thing. Differences in human capacities as displayed both individually and in national totalities. His definition of the slave in the Politics is not so admirable. ... and then the thing. A slave is a tool with a soul. Only in the most superficial and materialistic sense is this true. The slave as a human being is not a tool, and a tool has not a soul. In Islamic societies, however, the nature and the thrust of religious authority left little leeway for the use of Aristotle or any other non-Muslim apologists of slavery in this fashion. Wait, how long is this? Okay, we're literally at an hour, but I might as well keep going because it's 2 pages and we're almost at chapter 5. Okay, Islam and Eurocentrism. The history of Europe for the millennium following the 5th century of the Christian era had not been unmarkedly unilinear. This immense span of time contained little, if any, basis for teleological there we go, certainty. And let's underline it to come back to look up, because my phone not on. Certainty. Indeed, there had been eras such as the 8th century when the very presence of Western high culture had been faked, preserved in scattered outposts whose own fate had made doubly uncertain by barbarian invasions and the pathetic social and material conditions of the pagan societies that surrounded them. By the year 700, European learning had fled to the bogs of Ireland or the wild coast of Northumbria. It was in the monasteries of Ireland that fugitive scholars preserved the knowledge of Latin and even the Greek classics. It was in the monastery in Northumbria, and the greatest scholar of his time, the greatest historian of the whole Middle Ages, the Venerable Bede, B-E-D-E, lived and wrote. And it was from the monasteries of Ireland and England in the 8th and 9th centuries that English and Irish fugitives would return to a devastated Europe. Okay. Oh, this was, did I say what the title was? Islam and Eurocentrism. Okay. This girl, I was lighting this page up. Christendom slowly recovered. During what was called the Dark Age, allied with barbarian chiefs and kings, converted or otherwise, the church gradually grew into the most mature base for the feudal organization that characterized the early Middle Ages. It acquired land and the peasants and slaves who made that land productive and valuable, without the slightest sense of its moral bankruptcy. Moreover, the leaders of the Christian church unmercifully exploited its human base, legitimating the brutality of the nobility, their secular kin, and sharing the profits from the labor of bound workers, and a foreign trade more than 8 centuries long that delivered European slaves, among other goods, to Muslim merchants. Feudal Europe, for a time, however, proved to be capable of expansion while rotting from within. But it was only for a time. Elisa, I said yes. This is really important. Because don't you ever think of how, like, America's, like, eating itself, kind of? By the 13th century, I need to let that thought marinate. There's so many thoughts I should let marinate rather than saying them out loud. By the 13th century, that phase of European development was at a close. The system collapsed. The ruling class of feudal Europe were succeeded by their Mediterranean factors, merchants, traders, and bankers. They, in turn, spawned or defined the roles of these actors who supplied capital, technical and scientific expertise, and administrative skills to the states that would lead the emergence of capitalistic Europe. By then, however, European culture and consciousness had been profoundly affected. Legend, as we had seen, acquired the authority of history. Moral authority continued to dissipate. America, like now. Like when you see those pattern, and you see how like America as a Western civilization is like living within its past, within its history, it's like, it's crazy. The mystifying veil which the feudal ruling classes had created to hide or at least soften the crushing oppression that they had put in place, like the American dream, you know what I mean? Okay, was in tatters. Prester John's first appearance in the European imagination of the 12th century was consequently understandable. The legend, if it indeed originated from the ruling class, accomplished two very disparate ends. For one, it presented Europe's intelligentsia with a powerful counterpoint, inspired by Christian idealism, biblical imagery and splendor, Roman law, and Greco-Egyptian civil craftsmanship. Here was the ideal Christian society, secure in its political body and spiritual soul. Importante. It was measured by which the failures and the insidious corruptions of the actual Christendom would be calibrated in detail. A model Christian empire, which, when compared to Europe, displayed those faults that had contributed to the inability to defeat Islam, either spiritually or militarily. This was the legend's internal function. Its other significance, however, was more critical. The legend transmuted the world beyond Europe, the Indies, into Eurocentric terms. And that's what I literally just talked about. Isn't that interesting? Like, I learned about it in 2022, but then I read this book in 2023 for class. And it's like, girl, you can only imagine. Like, I did read the book when I was in class. I just didn't write, like, the notes that I'm writing now, like this. And, like, but I'm gonna, like, make it shorter because I'm thinking about different shorthands to break it down to be like, okay, this is what that said. For me, though, it's also for me. I'm not gonna lie, because sometimes it's like, wait, what? Okay, but keep going. Whatever was the reality of those lands, I like doing. Okay. Sorry. Whatever was the reality of those lands or their peoples came to be less important. And that's like, to finish that sentence, to see those connections. Anyways, for the next 300 years, between the 12th and 15th centuries, the legend of Prester John provided European scholars and their less learned coreligionists with a structured and obtuse prism through which the authenticity of every datum, every traveler's report, every intelligence of its foreign trade, every fable of its poet, and every fable of its soldiery would be screened and strained. Every direct evidence was not immune. For the next century, G.K. Hunter tells us this frame of reference was sustained. It's like that Anglo-Saxon, Christian, whatever, religious frame of reference. And then here's the quote. The new information from which the English voyages of the 16th century brought to the national culture had to be fitted, as it best could, into a received image of what was important. This means that the facts were not received in quite the same way as they would have been in the 19th century. Historians of the last century were much taken with the idea of the Elizabethan imagination liberated by the voyagers, but there was little evidence of this outside the unhistorical supposition. That's how I would have reacted. The voyages certainly did expand the physical horizon, but it is not clear that they expanded the cultural horizons at the same time. The image of man in his theological, political, and social aspects could not be much affected by the discovery of an empty or primitive lands. The architects of European consciousness, that's the end of the quote. And then the architects of European consciousness had begun the construction of that worldview that presumed the basic structure of other than European societies was at its foundation a European structure, that the moral, ideological, and spiritual scaffold of these societies was the same bottom structure discernible in European culture. Wait, what? Okay, we're gonna come. Okay. That the measure of mankind was indeed the European. Oh, it's saying that, like, you're a human if you're a European. You are not a human if you're other. And that's, like, that basis of, like, dehumanization and stuff. Okay. The legend of Prester John and his wondrous realm, the formidability of the purely Christian king who waited in patience for his Christian allies at the other end of the world, all this was the form of the impulse in its appropriate medieval costume. Thus, when the miraculous kingdom could not be located in the deserts and steppes, I don't know if that's steppes, it's Steppes. Steppes. Of Central Asia or even Cathay. That one's either Japan or China. I don't remember. Cathay. It did not cease its fascination, but was transferred to the south beyond the Upper Nile. The fantasy and its attendant resolve to bend the very existence of the being of other peoples into convenient shapes were important beings for the destruction of the African past. This very important. Importante. While the vitality of Islam had seemed to mock the pathetic feebleness of Christ's chosen, humiliating them in defeat, and with the persistent threat of further occupations and invasions, the legend was compelling, and a basic lesson of propaganda was learned. Europe's destiny was incompatible with the Oh, my phone's back on. We'll look up this word while we're here because I'm at. Oh my god, guys, I know I'm reading slow. THO. Autochthonous, indigenous, rather than descended from migrants or colonists. 5%. Okay. Indigenous. Meaning of the non-Europeans world. An increasing prominent concatenant of the European millennium, roughly from the 10th to the present century, would be the refutation of those terms. In freeing itself from Muslim colonization, Europe once again had a vigorous bourgeoisie and the state institutions to begin the construction of its own extra-European colonialism. From the 5th century on, the colonialism would encompass the lands of Asia, Africa, the New World peoples, and engulf a substantial fraction of those peoples into the European traditions of slave labor and exploitation. Let me make this whole point. This is important. I need to stop. Okay. Capitalists were, from this point on, no longer dependent on the material restraints Europe presented for the primitive accumulation of capital. With Genoese, I don't know if I'm saying that right, Genoese, Byzantine and Jewish capitalists accomplished for Portugal and Spain in the 14th century. What they accomplished for Portugal and Spain in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries on their expulsions from Iberia they transferred to northwestern Europe. So soon after, an English bourgeoisie succeeded those of Belgium and the Netherlands in the domination of the now extensive world system. We have, however, gone far beyond our immediate interests in the Muslim part of Europe's development. Here we must conclude, still somewhat arbitrarily and abruptly, the survey of the significance of Islam in European history. For the moment, it will have to be sufficient to remind ourselves that Islam once represented a more powerful civilization, and again, one closely identified in the European mind with African and Black peoples. And how that connects to like anti-Blackness. That's so interesting. Not interesting like, oh, interesting like, oh, you know. In retrospect, the Western potential for creating the Negro had moved closer in a way to its realization. The cultural and ideological inventory was at hand. A native racialism had already displayed its usefulness for rationalizing social order, and with the advent of Islamic intrusions into European history, it had further proved its value by its transformation into an instrument of collective resistance and a negation of an unacceptable past. For the Negro to come into being, all that was now required was an immediate cause, a specific purpose, the trade in African slaves. Coming as it did as an extension of capitalism and racial arrogance, supplied both a powerful motive and a readily received object. Chapter 4 is done! Now, Chapter 5. The Atlantic Slave Trade and African Labor. Guys, there's only 318 pages that we have to read, and now we're at page 101. 1/3. Okay, peace out, y'all.